Crossing Canada by train opens up this vast country the way the first explorers and settlers saw it, along great rivers and around great lakes, across prairies and over mountains, from sea to sea to sea. Railways helped open and unite the country. Our journey continues through central Canada, from the citadel of Quebec to the nation's capital. From the glamour of Niagara Falls to the wilderness of Hudson Bay and on across the prairies. Historic routes carry you on via rail through the busy corridor along the St. Lawrence River to the lower Great Lakes, into the Canadian Shield on the Hudson Bay and the Ontario Northland, through rugged canyons and vast muskeg on the Algoma Central, and westward on the fabled transcontinental train, the Canadian. Our journey through central Canada begins as we arrive at Quebec City Station. It's one of the railway's architectural gems. It looks like a French Renaissance castle with its high-pitched copper roof and walls of granite and limestone. Canadian Pacific had popularized this style when it built the Chateau Frontenac, which dominates the heights of Cape Diamond and honors both English and French conquerors of Quebec. The Chateau was the first in a series of opulent hotels built by CP Railroads to promote tourism. From across the river, the Chateau Frontenac looms over Place Royale, the oldest part of Quebec City.
People don't realize this, but we share the name with Detroit, Michigan. Detroit is a French word that means a strait, a narrowing of a waterway. And Quebec is Algonquin, and it means exactly the same thing, a narrowing of a waterway. Actually, the narrowest point is from the bridges right down to the citadel. Whoever controlled Quebec City controlled the entrance to North America. We started off here as a French settlement from 1608 till 1759. Now in 1759, the British took over the area. And then we went under a British rule until 1867. The city of Quebec is the only walled-in city in North America. Inside the walls, it's basically French, because when the English took over the city, they helped the French rebuild the city the French way. The foundations were still there. But outside the walls, these were cornfields at the time. So the British built, but using their own influence in the architecture, a lot of Victorian style.
Architecture that inspires the sidewalk artists.
I like to paint in the city because there's a lot of interesting shapes, lots of interesting angles, planes, multicolored roofs.
Quebec Summer Festival celebrates life and art in this vibrant city. There are more than 40 free shows every day. The city brims with buskers, and festival venues pop up everywhere, from cozy bars to cabarets. They are all within walking distance, so you can easily go concert hopping.
Moi, j'habite à l'île de la Réunion, n'est-ce pas?
René Lacaille came to Quebec City from Reunion Island in the Indian Ocean near Madagascar. René's music is influenced by Africa, as well as a mixture of the cultures on his island. Ambiance abounds. And just wandering the cobblestone lanes as horse-drawn carriages pass by makes you feel you've stepped back in time.
We have 2.5 miles of walls that surround the city. So anything within the walled city is historic old Quebec. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's protected. We have to keep our architecture exactly the way it was during the French and then the British regimes. All the old homes, the schools, the churches.
You could spend a whole day touring the churches alone, from Notre-Dame de Victoire in the lower town to chapels tucked away in side streets. And then there are the Plains of Abraham, where a 15-minute battle in 1759 shaped the history of Canada. Generals Wolfe and Montcalm fought to the death for possession of Quebec and the colony. Though the British won, the story goes that both leaders died happy.
Wolfe died happy because one of the last things he heard as he was carried back behind the line of fire was, "We have won." So he knew he was dying a hero. General Montcalm died happy also because he would never have to see his precious Quebec under the British domination.
Quebec City is surrounded by natural beauty, such as Montmorency Falls. It's a favorite summer spot, and the falls are nearly 30 meters higher than Niagara. Cross the bridge to Ile d'Orléans in the middle of the St. Lawrence River and be transported back in time, exploring the restored houses that reflect the island's roots.
A lot of them reminds about the French times, you know, because those houses have been restored as they used to look in those years. Normandy style and also Brittany style and French-Canadian style, which is a derivation from that.
Ile d'Orléans is home to several vineyards.
You see the fruit there, that this is the black currants, and I may pick some of them. But you notice they're not ripe exactly, not right now. Maybe in a week or so they're going to be ready.
Bernard's award-winning cassis makes a popular island cocktail. And in the heat of La Forge à Picasso, wrought iron is crafted into these cool designs. Northeast of Quebec City, along the St. Lawrence, is the World Biosphere Reserve, Charlevoix. The town of Baie-Saint-Paul has long been a mecca for artists.
I think a lot of artists come here because we have wonderful mountains beside the St. Lawrence River. The light also is very spectacular, you know. We have the river, and we have all the time clouds, and the clouds make zebra light in the mountains, and that's wonderful to paint.
Lunch at one of the local brew pubs can also give you a chance to put your palate to work.
The second one you have there is a Belgian white beer. It has coriander seeds in it, and has also orange peel in it.
After the mostly cultivated coastline, the terrain inland between Baie-Saint-Paul and the Parc des Grands Jardins is rugged and known for black bears.
Here we are in the middle of nowhere. It's very important because we have the moose, black bear, bobcat. But your respect is very important for you. You respect the black bear, and the black bear respect you.
A 15-minute ferry ride across the Saguenay River takes you to Tadoussac, which for a few months of the year is home to whales from belugas to blues.
In front of Tadoussac, you have like a wall of sediment. And because of that, well, especially in this area, it's a special geology. You have meeting of three currents, and you have what we call from the current coming from the sea upwelling. So you have a lot of food at the surface, and whales come here in the St. Lawrence, especially for the alimentation. So they come here, they eat 20 hours by day, they get fat, they have only a few months between April to October, and after that they leave us.
Whales or no whales, there is always the historic Hotel Tadoussac. For a taste of the Charlevoix region, take the Route des Saveurs. It's a partnership between chefs and local farmers who grow an array of unusual and colorful vegetables that are then transformed into a feast for the eyes. Leaving Quebec City, Via Rail's busiest line carries us westwards to Montreal, the elegant and commercial heart of the province. Montreal flourishes with a predominantly French-speaking community that gives the city its distinctive cosmopolitan ambience. One of the highlights of this elegant city is Les Jardins Botaniques. Within the Japanese garden can be found an oasis of calm and a display of rare beauty. The bonsai in this collection have been preserved for many generations and vary in age from 25 to 350 years. Old Montreal may be all cobblestones and quaint laneways, but it also is home to iSci Centre, Quebec's first interactive science and entertainment complex.
We have 3 exhibition halls where you can do hands-on activities. Along with the 3 science interactive exhibitions, we have also a new interactive cinema, which is called Immersion. We are very proud of it because it's a new technology and it's Canadian. It's in a cinema, so you have 3 giant screens and you have 100 participants who decide the scenario of the movie. And people travel inside the human body, so you see exactly what is in your body, and at the same time you have to kill parasites. But we don't know how the movie will end because you vote, you make decisions, but the other 99% do the same thing, and it's the average which make the movie going into one direction or another one.
And there are still more amazing scenes on the giant screen of the 3D IMAX theater. The Via Rail's main corridor connects Montreal to the nation's capital, Ottawa. This is a city for all seasons, a city of culture and pageantry, a city that always has something special going on. February's Winterlude will certainly snap you out of those winter blues. The city on the Rideau Canal celebrates ice and snow with skating, sleigh rides, and an ice sculpture competition that attracts carvers from all over the world. Each spring, the Canadian Tulip Festival transforms the capital into a kaleidoscope of color. It all started with a gift of tulip bulbs from the Dutch royal family who sheltered in Ottawa during the Second World War. The tulips were a way of saying thanks. And in summer, Ottawa offers miles of bicycle paths and lots of locks for boaters on the Rideau Canal flowing right through town. On a hill overlooking the Ottawa River, the country's business is conducted inside the intriguing Gothic architecture of the Parliament buildings. By contrast, just across the river, in the city of Hull, in Quebec, these distinctive buildings are home to the Museum of Civilization, designed by architect Douglas Cardinal.
When he saw the site beside the great river, he felt very strongly that the building should look like the land looked after the last ice age, when the great sea was here, and then as the land began to rise, this form, this molding, this mounding would happen.
Autumn puts a colorful face on the Ottawa region, especially in the nearby Gatineau Hills. And one of the best ways to savor it is in a hot air balloon.
I like flying in the fall. I think it's the best time to fly because the air is a little more stable than in the summer. You get your thunderstorms and your warmer air in the summer. So the fall is nice. You get the colors and it's cooler out.
Gatineau Park, a playground set in wilderness, lies within sight of Ottawa's Parliament buildings. The park stretches some 50 kilometers into the Canadian Shield and contains historic sites like Kingsmere. This estate was a summer home of former Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. He had these cloisters built as a sort of ruins. Some of the stones came from the original Canadian Parliament building destroyed by fire in 1916. Other stones came from London's House of Commons, bombed during the Second World War.
At Montreal, leave in a few moments. Votre attention, dernier appel. Le train.
Back on Via Rail, we head across eastern Ontario to Toronto. Toronto marks its spot on the Canadian skyline with dramatic architecture. Trendy shops. A sparkling waterfront. And a flood of festivals, from jazz in the beaches Caribbean dancing on the islands. Toronto may be the economic heart of Canada, but the soul of the city lives in its ethnic neighborhoods. At the Royal Ontario Museum, there's a world of another kind.
The ROM has got a lot of variety in its exhibits because it's got both mandates of natural history, that's nature, and of human civilization. So we're very lucky to be able to say on one hand you can go into one of North America's great collection of Chinese artifacts to something like the dinosaurs, where we have one of North America's and the world's great collection of dinosaur skeletons.
For a look into yesteryear and its grander lifestyle, Casa Loma celebrates history and romance.
The architecture of Casa Loma itself is always interesting to me because many people look at the style and think this was the stuff of Sir Henry Pellet's overactive imagination, and I would say that it isn't. A Gothic Revival is a blend of Gothic and Romanesque styles, and that's exactly what we have at Casa Loma.
Natural history comes alive at the Toronto Zoo. Orphaned polar bear cubs, western lowland gorillas, and Siberian tigers are all lovingly cared for in a setting designed to be as much like their own natural habitats as possible. But Toronto has a secret: its green spaces. Just steps away from traffic are inviting pathways for cyclists and pedestrians to explore. This trail, the Belt Line, was once a railway line built by John Moore.
And we have commuter trains all over Canada now that run intercity. But this was an early version of that. And by early, I mean early, 1892. So we're talking more than a century ago. Now, you might be able to hear in the background the sound of the subway, which is kind of interesting because the subway goes under where Mr. Moore's Beltline Railway went over. You still see the bridge on Yonge Street.
Ontario is a vast province. Its population sprawls along the southern borders in modern towns and cities of steel, glass, and concrete that pierce the skyline, framing the northern fringes of the Great Lakes. Yet from here to the shores of Hudson Bay, Ontario remains a wilderness with 90% of its area densely forested. There are many ways to explore this wilderness. The Ontario Northland train from Toronto takes you to outlying Aboriginal communities, from where you can fly even further north on fishing and wildlife expeditions. From the end of the line at Moosonee, you can cross the river to Moose Factory, which began life as a trading center for the Hudson's Bay Company. The factor lived here and paid the trappers for their furs based on the size and the thickness of the pelts.
Well, the area was inhabited first by the Crees, and it was established as a fur trading post by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1673. Each dwelling represents the season in which we would be out on the land hunting, fishing, trapping.
Well, you can say we've been here for thousands of years, but the community didn't exist till an early 1900 because of that's when the missionary and Hudson Bay Post moved in. Before that, people used to just scatter all over the country.
Strangers don't often pass this way, so it's not unusual when locals like Susan and her father, Louis Bird, welcome you into their homes and their teepees. Further northwest on the shores of Hudson Bay, you reach Polar Bear Provincial Park.
Well, it has three environments in one. We have the bay, we have the tundra, and the tree line fluctuates from 5 to 15 miles. There are all kinds of species of animals, so it's very unique. You can have a black bear and polar bear, caribou and moose, or inland birds and shore birds and tundra birds. Looking straight at it.
The mouth of the Sutton River is a home for polar bears and their cubs, while offshore is the territory of a pod of beluga whales. A bird's-eye view of Ontario shows off a wealth of fresh water in more than 100,000 lakes. No wonder Ontarians have devised so many ways to enjoy this natural legacy.
Georgian Bay is really the sixth Great Lake. I mean, it used to be called Lake Manitou, and it's bigger than Lake Erie in terms of square miles or square kilometers, and obviously in terms of water depths. First of all. Secondly, after Superior, it has the best scenery of any of the Great Lakes. The shoreline on the east shore is the Canadian Shield, and on the west side is the Niagara Escarpment. And of course, as it blends into the North Channel, and we get to see Manitoulin Island, we like to tell everybody that's as good as the Greek islands, as good as the Caribbean for sailing and for cruising, because you see something different every day. Plus, we have some ports that are so small, nobody else could go there.
The smaller ship is able to navigate these narrow channels. Smaller still, a kayak can travel some 30 kilometers through the Fox Islands along the Georgian Bay shoreline.
It becomes very, very rugged. There's not a lot of industrialization. It's a great opportunity to paddle. And also with all the shoals and the islands, you can get away from the big power boats and the sailboats. And it's a haven for sea kayakers.
Georgian Bay has been immortalized by the group of 7 painters who captured on canvas the windswept pines, the pink granite rocks, and the ever-changing waters of the bay. To say nothing of the sunsets. Well over a century ago, when the trains and roads stopped in Gravenhurst, the only way north was by steamer to the north end of Lake Rosso, and then a stagecoach over to Georgian Bay. Today, the Seguin is the last remaining ship of a fleet of 11 that once plied the Muskoka Lakes. Ontario's waterways, like the Trent-Severn system, were the original travel routes. Long before the highways and the railroads, there were canals. By the 19th century, they were being carved through the wilderness, linking Ontario's maze of rivers.
When you're in Ontario, there's 100,000 lakes, and the only way to really experience Ontario is to be on the water, and a houseboat allows you to do that at your own pace. You don't need to make any plans. Just stay where you want, move at the pace you wish.
Autumn is one of the best times of the year to cruise the lakes and savor the beauty and the wildlife of provincial parks like Algonquin. You can get even closer to those that call the woods home at Aspen Valley Wildlife Sanctuary. Here, sick and injured animals recover in shelters that are as close to their natural habitat as possible. Tony Grant gets them back on their feet so they can be returned to the wild.
We put back about 90% of what comes in, and this year we were almost to 1,000 animals.
Even wolves that had been illegally crossbred with dogs have found sanctuary at Aspen Valley. Along Ontario's southernmost border on the shores of Lake Erie are 2 parks where birds and butterflies rest during their spring and fall migrations. Long Point has been recognized as a United Nations Biosphere Reserve. This spit of land that was shaped over 5,000 years has 4 distinct areas: marshlands, a bird observatory, a Carolinian forest, and a provincial park with sand dunes and beaches.
That's very soft. We've gently fallen into the pocket here. One of the main functions of the Bird Observatory is to monitor populations of birds, especially the species that breed in northern Canada in the boreal forests where we can't study them on the breeding grounds. Get it out. This bird has the good fortune not to be There's well over 200 species recorded in the Long Point area. We certainly do get some rare species, and that's one of the exciting things for the bird watchers here.
14.3 grams.
He's gone.
Well, this is Big Creek National Wildlife Area. It was purchased by the Canadian Wildlife Service from a private hunting club in the early 70s because it was an important migratory stopover area for waterfowl, mostly mallards and widgeons. And in a partnership with Ministry of Natural Resources and Ducks Unlimited Canada and the Conservation Authority, we've constructed a diked area here where there's an opportunity for people to experience and learn about the wetlands, because there's a walking trail. It takes you about 45 minutes to walk around, and you can walk out into the marsh and see the snakes and frogs and turtles as well as the birds. If you want to come and see the wildlife spectacle, the best time is to come in late March, early April. If you want to take in a little more of the subtleties of the marsh in terms of turtles and snakes and frogs and things, then middle of May to June is good. And then in the fall, it's not quite as spectacular usually with the waterfall, but late September, early October can be quite nice a time. You can see the monarch butterflies migrating at that time as well.
Point Pelee, jutting out into Lake Erie, is the most southerly point in Canada. Migrations bring more than 350 different kinds of birds, along with monarch butterflies.
Monarch butterflies stop here on their way to Mexico. They get waylaid here if we have certain weather conditions that keep them at the point. And today is a perfect example of that. This wind coming from the southwest is not going to allow any monarchs to leave Point Pelee today. So they're going to end up very frustratedly waiting here until it's their chance to get across the lake.
The Point Pelee Spit is all that's left of an ancient land bridge formed after the last glacial period. It continues its time-honored role as a way station on the migrating routes of birds and insects.
A monarch butterfly can't land on water. A lot of the little songbirds, the bats, even the hawks don't like to fly over open water. So what they do is they follow the landform down. They also have a lot of food, like a lot of the flowering plants that are out there for the monarchs at this time, the nectar that they eat to gain energy on their migration down to Mexico, and a lot of the insects, mosquitoes and flies and that sort of thing for the songbirds, and of course the hawks that eat the songbirds that are following the insects.
Pelee Island is also perfect for vineyards, which have put it and Niagara on the world's wine map.
And we're sitting inside a barrel, downstairs in our basement, as we call it, the tasting room. It just goes to show you that we can reuse them in other ways instead of just throwing them out after we can't use them anymore if they've cracked or if they've had other problems with them. Pelee Island is an old coral reef, so it's limestone based, and there's clay on top. And clay sometimes isn't qualified as being really nice soil, but it does force the vines to dig deep for the nutrients, and that's quite beneficial in developing, as they say in France, a terroir, and that contributes to Pelee Island having a really unique flavor to its wines.
Even more wineries have grown up astride Niagara's wine trail, just one of many attractions in this garden region of Ontario.
You have also man-made attractions like the Journey Behind the Falls, the Great Gorge Adventure, the Aero Car, just lots of things that people can see and do. Probably the most exciting attraction, in my opinion, is the Maid of the Mist. It's been operating since 1846, a scenic boat tour that takes you right into the shoe, as the local people call it. You not only see Niagara, but you feel it, you taste it, and you can literally touch it. You get that close.
Then winter freezes the falls and produces another extraordinary view. At historic Union Station in downtown Toronto, we board Canada's most famous train, the Canadian. From Toronto, it wends its wooded way northwards to the shores of Lake Superior. At Sault Ste. Marie, you can connect to rail excursions into the Agawa Canyon on the Algoma Central Railway. It takes a day to penetrate a wilderness of forest, lakes, and rivers to reach deep into the canyon. In the fall, a 2-hour stopover is long enough for a vigorous climb to a panoramic lookout for some stunning photographs.
Hey, one more time for the Agawa Central. One more time for the Agawa Central. Let's hear it now, folks. Everybody do the la-di-da. Hey, la-di-da.
When the snow flies, so does the snow train. It snakes through a wonderland of frozen lakes, snow-laden trees, and icy waterfalls sculpted by nature. Adventure enthusiasts can use the train to transport their snowmobiles, snowshoes, camping and fishing gear for wilderness treks. Back in the comfort of the Canadian, we continue on our journey through Ontario's wet and wild scenery to Winnipeg. The Canadian pulls into Winnipeg in the early afternoon. The capital of Manitoba has been called an old city in a new country and still retains its turn-of-the-century architecture.
All transportation, trade, and immigration passed through Winnipeg, so it saw for itself a future as the Chicago of the North. One of the jewels, architecturally speaking, is what's known as the Exchange District. This would have been essentially the first downtown of Winnipeg, sort of 1880s to 1914. There's very impressive brick buildings and so on. There's a street that was known as Newspaper Row, or as the old Telegram Building. In the 1880s, land at the corner of Portage and Main were fetching the same prices that a square foot of land were costing in New York City. St. Boniface itself has a number of very interesting structures as well. The St. Boniface Museum, for instance, is the only remnant, other than the Fort Garry Gate, of the Red River period. It's the largest oak log building in North America. It's been a National Historic Site since 1958. But of course, the real jewel in the crown in St. Boniface is the cathedral and the basilica ruins. The basilica, of course, was an outstanding architectural treasure. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by fire in 1968. But the success that the architect achieved in melding the old exterior with the modern cathedral, I think, is just marvelous.
Manitoba is full of surprises. There are rolling prairies, dense forests, wet marshlands, and colorful valleys.
Polkamic Marsh was one of the first drainage districts in Western Canada. Then in the early 70s, Ducks Unlimited and the Department of Natural Resources got together and decided to restore a portion of the former marsh that had existed here. And they also built a number of nesting islands to provide some safe areas for birds to nest. Wetlands are second only to rainforests in the amount of biological diversity that they contain.
At Gimli, Islandigadagarin is a celebration of Icelandic heritage. The Icelanders came here about 125 years ago after a devastating volcanic eruption in their homeland. They settled in Gimli and Hekla on Lake Winnipeg.
The first Icelanders came here to settle as colonists in 1875.
When they arrived in open barges in late October, it was already snowing and a winter storm was brewing. The steamship Coldwell had managed to tow them here to Willow Point on Lake Winnipeg. As the blizzard worsened, the captain warned them to turn back or they would all perish.
And they were totally in disagreement with him. They argued with him for some 2 hours, and then finally he chopped the rope and let them go. They came to an absolute total wilderness. There was nothing but trees and swamp.
It was a rude welcome, but they survived. And the annual Islandigadagarin celebrates the strength and character of those early pioneers. There are no roads leading to the next stop of our journey. The only way to get there is by plane or by train. Churchill, Manitoba is Canada's only Arctic seaport. It's also the polar bear capital of the world. The essence of both the wildlife and Inuit lifestyle is captured in soapstone by carvers like Camilla Ikelik. In the fall, travelers in search of polar bears and caribou get around in tundra buggies. They stick to bumpy old trails to avoid further damage to the fragile environment. In the tundra, there's only a few centimeters of soil above the bedrock, yet it supports more than 200 different species of plants. West of Winnipeg at Spruce Woods Provincial Park, prehistoric spear tips have been dated back to the Clovis people, hunters of the now extinct giant bison and mammoth.
It was first used by native people hundreds of years ago. And then after that, with the dawn of the fur trade, it became a popular place for fur traders to use at the junction of the Epinette and the Assiniboine River. We have a healthy population of beaver, which is part of the reason for the fur trade. The Spirit Sands, they were first formed about 18,000 years ago when the river draining into glacial Lake Agassiz left the deposits of sand. And then as the lake receded, the sands was still well above the surrounding water, and it first began getting colonized by plants such as spruce and tamarack and then grasses. But it's the sands themselves that make it unique.
Brandon is Manitoba's second largest city. It began as a CPR post in 1881, but is known throughout the Commonwealth for its role during the Second World War. This is where British, Australian, and New Zealand pilots learned to fly, one of Canada's great contributions to the Allied victory. The museum in a wartime hangar remembers the war years.
There's 14 aircraft on display, as well as uniforms, all other kinds of memorabilia, photographs, etc.
North Brandon Station has such a short platform that the train sometimes has to pull ahead so everyone can get on and off.
This is your second call for dinner in the dining car.
Once back on board the Canadian, dinner is served. It is early morning when the Canadian arrives at Saskatoon. Saskatoon may be in the middle of the prairies, but it's known as the City of Bridges.
Small towns in Saskatchewan are having a difficult time. We're fortunate we have a resource. It's the nationally significant history that's here. We borrowed the idea from Chemainus on Vancouver Island.
The dream of a Métis state on the prairies ended here in Saskatchewan in 1885 at the Battle of Batoche. The year before, Louis Riel had petitioned Ottawa for Métis land rights and better conditions for starving Indian bands. When Ottawa turned him down, Riel set up a provisional government. Ottawa dispatched the military to put down the uprising. After a 4-day siege, Batoche was captured. Riel was hanged for treason. Indian leaders Big Bear and Poundmaker were jailed and died shortly after getting out of prison. Depending on which side you were on, the West had been won and lost. What archaeologists found at Wanaskewin, just outside Saskatoon, bolstered the belief that ancient Aboriginal societies had developed around a phenomenon called buffalo jumps.
The archaeologists that first arrived here in the 3032 were looking at the very readily visible sites, such as the Medicine Wheel site, the teepee rings. It wasn't until later they started to investigate the valley and such that things were eroding out of the creek banks, such as bones and pottery. People have been using this valley for just about 6,000 years and using it as a hunting area, place to procure bison, berries, and things like that. Plains Cree tradition was an oral tradition, so all these things were passed down through storytelling from elders and on to younger people. I think it's hard for people to imagine that it hasn't been written down, these things, you know, even though 6,000 years old. We're not going to find any clay tablets or anything like that out here.
The boreal forest is one of the largest terrestrial ecosystems on the entire face of the planet, and most of the northern hemisphere is covered with boreal forests. It covers more than a third of what Canada is landmass. It's an area typified by long, cold winters and a very short growing season. And the forests that are a result of that are predominantly coniferous forests. Prince Albert National Park is on the southern edge of the Great Northern Forest. And because of that, we see quite a blending of the animal habitats and the different kinds of vegetation, and very rich species diversity in this area.
We have species that you'll find in the southern habitats, typical of southern Saskatchewan, of course, and those species in the north. For instance, in the south, we'll find elk and white-tailed deer, and in the corner of the park, we'll find plains bison.
Prince Albert National Park has a population of somewhere between, 60 and 100 wolves, a healthy population and definitely a viable population of wolves.
I think we've got like 200 species of birds, everything from a couple of species of hummingbirds, so ones rarely seen, right up to loons and all sorts of species of woodpeckers and owls, a great diversity that way. The more we build and change the national park, the less there is of what people come here for the recreation and for the rejuvenation.
People like to make an awful lot about the importance of the rainforest, and certainly it is one of the organs of the earth, but the boreal forest is also one of the vital organs of the earth because of its immense size.
It was here in Prince Albert National Park that Grey Owl, the famous and eccentric conservationist, lived, sharing a cabin with 2 pet beaver. His notoriety came from deception. He had fooled everyone.
The greater public certainly was of that mind that he was a half-breed Indian, and that he was coming from the wilds of Canada to tell this story. He was really an Englishman. His name was Archibald Bellany from Hastings, England. When he emigrated to Canada as a young man, he embarked on a complete transition of his lifestyle from a young, well-to-do Englishman into a half-breed bushman. In short, he became a conservationist rather than a hunter and a trapper. And he became very famous for his books and his films and his lecture tours, inspiring people about the beauty of the Canadian wilderness and the need to protect that.
Grey Owl died in 1938 and was buried on the shores of Ajawan Lake in Prince Albert National Park, where his cabin still stands.
This park was established in 1927 in a transition zone between the prairies and aspen parkland and the boreal forest of what is really central Saskatchewan. You know, fungi just never get enough credit for their role in the ecosystem, and I'm glad that we're spending a few extra moments to take a look at them. So important in the cycle of decomposition and release of nutrients and things. Some of them can come up through the ground virtually overnight. You know, it doesn't take 24, 48 hours maybe for them to pop. And what we're looking at is just the fruiting body, just the reproductive structures. What's really amazing, and we'll never get a footage of it, are all the fungal fingers that spread out underneath the forest floor and link this forest with the rest of the organisms. We've got smaller woodpeckers like blackback woodpeckers and three-toed woodpeckers that will search the bark and flick off pieces of it with their bills, and then they'll feed on the insects underneath. It's a mature trembling aspen, probably around 70 or 80 years, something like that, for this growing site. And obviously they felled it, and it just happened to end up in the creek bed. And as you can see, they've cut off the upper branches. They've topped the tree after it's been down. They'll use those upper branches for the dam and the lodge, and the smaller branches and leaves, of course, they'll use as feed, either incorporating them into the dam or lodge, or probably into a food raft for the wintertime.
Back aboard the Canadian, we head west out of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, bound for Alberta and points west in British Columbia. As prairie wheat fields give way to cattle ranches and the land begins to rise into the foothills of the Rockies, passengers can look forward to the mountains and glaciers of Alberta and British Columbia as we continue our railway adventures across Canada.